The sun hung low over the Georgia plantation, casting long, flickering shadows across the fields where slaves toiled under the relentless heat. The air was thick with the scent of cotton and sweat, and the distant creak of the plantation gates opened the day to the arrival of a new slave. She stepped from the wagon with a quiet dignity that immediately set her apart. Her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the world around her, taking in every detail: the worn faces of the slaves, the oppressive gaze of the overseers, and the grand, imposing mansion where the masters lived in luxury. She carried no fear, at least none that could be seen. To those who looked at her for the first time, she seemed like any other young woman brought to the fields, but there was an unspoken energy about her, a tension that made the air around her feel different. The other slaves whispered among themselves, exchanging glances that were equal parts curiosity and caution. No one knew her name yet, but something told them she was not like the others. From the moment she set foot on the plantation, she sensed the danger that lingered in every corner. The masters ruled with cruelty, their hands quick to punish, their tempers as unpredictable as the southern storms. She had heard stories before, rumors of slaves who had tried to resist and paid with their lives. But there was a steel in her spine, a determination that had been forged long before she arrived here. She had survived the horrors of the journey, the cruel hands of traders, and the endless march toward this very place, and each trial had only sharpened her senses. As she walked through the fields, her feet leaving soft impressions in the damp earth, she watched the overseers and the dogs with careful calculation, noting their routines, their patterns, and the spaces where she could move unseen. Every movement, every glance was a test, a small battle in a war she had already begun within her own mind. The other slaves noticed the way she held herself. She did not bow her head or avert her eyes when a master passed. She did not flinch at the snap of a whip or the bark of an overseer's orders. There was a quiet defiance in her posture, subtle enough to avoid immediate punishment, but unmistakable to those who watched closely. The women in the quarters whispered to each other, sharing tales of her resilience, and even the men, usually hardened by years of oppression, felt a flicker of awe. She seemed untouchable, not because she was invincible, but because she moved through the plantation with an understanding of the danger that surrounded her. Every glance, every step was deliberate, calculated, as if she were already planning the moment when the scales would tip in her favor. The masters, of course, did not see this. They were blinded by their arrogance, convinced that any slave could be broken with enough force or fear. When they first laid eyes on her, they saw only a young woman, small and seemingly fragile, with dark skin and delicate features that invited underestimation. One of them, a man with a reputation for cruelty, smirked as he approached her, convinced that her fear would be instantaneous, her submission inevitable. But when he reached out, she did not shrink or tremble. Her hand moved with a precision and speed that startled him, not with violence at first, but with a strength and firmness that sent a clear message. She was not to be trifled with. The look in her eyes was enough to make him pause, a silent warning he could neither fully understand nor ignore. As the days passed, the plantation itself seemed to recognize her presence. The other slaves began to speak in hushed tones about her, using cautious words as if even speaking her name too loudly might draw attention from the masters. They noticed the way she moved through the fields, how she seemed to blend into the shadows, yet always remain aware of the smallest detail, the flick of a wrist, the whisper of a command, the direction of a glance. She was learning the rhythms of the plantation quickly, understanding the vulnerabilities in the system, the cracks in the master's control. And in return, the masters began to notice her, though none could articulate why. There was something about her that unsettled them, something that made their usual tactics of intimidation falter. They tried subtle threats, casual remarks meant to intimidate, but she met each one with calm, unflinching composure. Nightfall brought its own set of dangers. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields darkened, the sounds of crickets and distant dogs created a deceptive sense of calm. The plantation seemed almost peaceful, yet every shadow held potential threat. She would sit quietly in the corner of the slave quarters, her thoughts racing as she considered the day's events, the movements of the masters, and the whispers she had heard from the others. She was not just surviving. She was observing, calculating, learning. Every incident, every glance of curiosity or malice was a piece of a larger puzzle she was beginning to assemble. Her mind was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and she wielded it silently, waiting for the moment when it would serve her purpose. By the end of her first week, it became clear to everyone who watched that she was no ordinary slave. The overseers began to whisper among themselves, uneasy at her presence. Even the masters, who had dismissed her at first, began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Rumors began to circulate, the kind that spread quickly on a plantation, the story of a young woman who did not bend, who did not cower, who carried an air of quiet authority that none could touch. Fear began to mingle with curiosity. They could not explain why she inspired such dread, only that it was impossible to ignore. The other slaves looked to her with a mixture of admiration and hope. She became a symbol not yet of outright rebellion, but of potential, a reminder that even in the darkest of places there were those who refused to be broken. Her presence alone seemed to shift the energy of the plantation, where fear had reigned absolute. A subtle tension now lingered, a question of what might happen if someone pushed her too far. And as she lay in her small cot at night, listening to the whispers and the creaking of the plantation, she felt the thrill of anticipation. She knew that her survival depended not just on strength, but on intelligence, on patience, on the ability to turn the very fear that surrounded her into a shield and a weapon. It was a dangerous world, a world built on oppression and violence, and she had just arrived. Yet, even as the shadows of the mansion stretched long across the fields, she did not feel small or powerless. She felt alive, she felt aware, and most importantly, she felt ready. Ready for the challenges that would come, ready for the masters who underestimated her, ready for the battles that were already forming in the silent corridors of the plantation. No one knew her name yet, but every master would soon learn to fear it. In the quiet moments before sleep, she replayed every detail of the day, the commands barked by overseers, the subtle glances exchanged between masters, the unspoken rules that governed every action on the plantation. Every movement, every word, was a puzzle she was solving, and with each passing hour she grew stronger, more vigilant, more untouchable. The plantation had been her world for only a week, yet she already understood it in ways no one else could. She was a storm gathering quietly, a force that the plantation had never seen and would not soon forget. The danger she represented was not in brute strength alone, but in the intelligence, courage, and unyielding spirit that no whip, no command, and no threat could ever break. As dawn approached, the first light creeping through the cracks of the slave quarters, she rose silently, already thinking of the day ahead. She moved with purpose, each step a declaration of presence and intent. To the casual observer, she might appear as any other woman forced into labor, but she was something else entirely, something the plantation would learn, to its regret, that it could never control. The air of inevitability that clung to her was palpable. The masters might try, as they always did, to impose their will, but this was one woman who had already decided she would not be dominated. The defiance she carried like a hidden weapon was enough to make the bravest of men hesitate. By the time the sun fully rose, casting its harsh light across the fields, the plantation had subtly changed. Something had shifted in the energy of the place, something that no one could name but everyone could feel. It was the presence of a woman who refused to bow, a spirit unbroken in a world designed to break her. Her story had only just begun, and already the air was charged with anticipation, with fear, and with the knowledge that the masters had underestimated the wrong person. She was here, she was ready, and the plantation would never be the same again. The sun had barely risen over the Georgia plantation when the air already carried the heavy scent of sweat and cotton. The fields shimmered in the morning heat, and the distant mansion towered like a silent overseer, a constant reminder of power and cruelty. Among the workers in the fields, the whispers had begun. The new woman, the one who had arrived with quiet dignity and eyes like dark coals, was no ordinary slave. Her presence alone seemed to bend the tension of the plantation, stretching it taut like a bowstring ready to snap. Even the other slaves, hardened by years of suffering, moved a little more carefully around her, aware of the silent strength that clung to her like a shadow. But it was the masters who would soon learn that her presence was far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The first master to take notice of her was one who had grown accustomed to bending others to his will without question. He was a man used to obedience, to fear, and to the unquestioned power of his hand. When he approached her that morning, he did so with a confident swagger, convinced that she would be no different from the others who had passed through the fields. His eyes, sharp and predatory, swept over her, drinking in her figure with the expectation of instant submission. He did not see the fire in her gaze, the quiet intelligence that measured every movement and assessed every possibility. To him, she was just another possession, another vessel of labor to be broken under the weight of his authority. As he drew closer, she met his gaze without flinching. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, calculating awareness that unnerved him more than he cared to admit. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, expecting resistance to crumble under the weight of his touch, but instead of shrinking away or crying out, she responded with swift, precise motion that startled him. Her movement was not wild or uncontrolled, it was deliberate, like the strike of a serpent coiling before it strikes. She twisted her body, elbowing him sharply in the side, her strength far greater than he anticipated. He stumbled backward, cursing under his breath, shocked that the frail-looking woman before him had the power to push him so easily. The other slaves in the field froze, sensing that something Untold was about to unfold. Even the overseers hesitated. The crack of their whips paused in mid-air as they watched the confrontation with wide eyes. This was not a struggle of brute force alone, it was a battle of wills. The master, enraged and humiliated, lashed out with a fist, aiming to strike her down before she could fully react. But she was ready. Her reflexes were sharp, honed by years of survival and a keen awareness that danger could come from any angle. She ducked, twisted and countered, her movements almost fluid in their precision. The punch that had been meant to subdue her, instead, glanced harmlessly past, and in that instant the dynamic shifted. Fear entered the eyes of the man who had always thought himself untouchable. He advanced again, this time with a calculated aggression, but each step was met with a defensive grace that belied her size. Every strike he attempted to land was countered with skill and speed. Her eyes never left his, unwavering and unyielding, as if daring him to understand that his power meant nothing here. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, the anger in his face twisting into disbelief. He had never encountered a slave who could so effortlessly resist, who could turn his own strength against him. And as the struggle continued, the other slaves began to murmur quietly, the rumors of her courage growing louder with every passing moment. It was then that she saw the glint of a hidden knife tucked into his belt, a weapon meant to ensure his control and enforce his dominance. The realization did not frighten her, instead it focused her mind with razor-sharp clarity. If he wanted to escalate, she would not falter. In a move that was both swift and terrifyingly precise, she grabbed a nearby stick, feinting toward him while keeping her distance. The master lunged, overconfident in his own strength, and she sidestepped, using his momentum against him. The stick struck the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the ground with a grunt of shock and pain. The plantation seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it could have been sliced with a blade. But this was only the beginning. The master scrambled to rise, his pride wounded more than his body, and he reached for the knife. She anticipated the move instinctively, striking at his wrist with a force that caused the knife to clatter to the ground. The sound echoed across the field, a terrifying punctuation that confirmed the reality of what was happening. This woman, this seemingly fragile figure, had disarmed a man who had considered himself untouchable. Panic flickered across his face, but his fury drove him forward once more, this time with reckless abandon. It was the kind of desperation that came only when control was slipping from one's grasp, and it made him even more dangerous. She did not hesitate. Her next movements were a combination of precision and survival instinct, each action measured and exact. She struck at his arm, twisting and jerking in a way that forced him off balance. His cries of rage and frustration pierced the air, cutting through the murmurs of the other slaves. The overseers, realizing that this was no ordinary struggle, finally began to react, shouting and running toward them. But it was too late. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the first master would not leave it unscathed. In a final, decisive motion, she used the force of his own charge to topple him over, and with a strength that seemed impossible, she delivered a blow that ended the fight. The man lay on the ground, groaning and writhing, defeated in a way that no one could have predicted. The field fell silent, the other slaves too shocked to speak, the overseers too stunned to act immediately. In that silence, a new understanding passed through the plantation, a recognition that the balance of power had shifted, at least temporarily. The woman who had arrived so quietly had just claimed a victory that no one expected, and the fear that rippled through the mansion would linger long after the echoes of the fight faded. From that moment on, whispers spread like wildfire. The story of the first master's defeat traveled quickly, carried in hushed tones from quarters to quarters, from field to field. Every slave who heard it felt a mixture of awe and hope, while every overseer and master felt a creeping unease they could not explain. They could not comprehend how one woman, seemingly so small and delicate, could overturn the very rules Hay had built with fear and violence. Her presence alone was now a force of terror and respect, a symbol of resistance that no whip or command could erase. The first master, humiliated and nursing his wounds, retreated to the mansion, his mind racing with anger, confusion and disbelief. He had expected obedience, fear and submission, and instead he had encountered a storm, a living force of defiance that had shattered his assumptions and challenged the very hierarchy he depended on. In private, he vowed revenge, convinced that the humiliation he suffered demanded retribution, but he knew deep down that this woman was no ordinary adversary. Her intelligence, reflexes and courage had revealed a danger he could neither ignore nor control. Meanwhile, the other slaves watched her with renewed respect. They had seen what she was capable of, had witnessed her confront danger head-on and emerge victorious. Some quietly began to see her as a beacon, someone who reminded them that even in the depths of oppression, strength and defiance could survive. She had not yet become a legend, but the seeds were sown. Her first confrontation had not just been a battle, it had been a statement, a declaration that she would not be broken, that the masters who underestimated her would pay the price for their arrogance. The plantation, usually so predictable and rigid, now shifted subtly. A new tension hung in the air, palpable and unsettling. Masters walked a little more cautiously. Overseers second-guessed their actions, and the other slaves moved with an awareness that the old rules no longer applied in quite the same way. Fear had a new face, one they could not easily suppress or rationalize. The first master's mistake had opened a door that hinted at what could come next, a door that no one wanted to see opened but could no longer ignore. As night fell, the plantation seemed to hold its breath, the events of the day replaying in every mind. The new slave, quiet and composed, returned to her quarters, her movements measured, her mind already planning, already aware that this was only the beginning. She had faced her first real threat, and she had not only survived, but had asserted her power in a way that would echo for days, weeks, perhaps even months. Her presence was now inseparable from the fear she inspired, and she carried it like a weapon, silent, deadly, and impossible to dismiss. By the end of that day, no one on the plantation could look at her the same way again. Masters and overseers alike understood, even if they did not speak it aloud, that this woman was unlike anyone they had encountered. Her first victory had set the tone, establishing her as a force to be reckoned with, and the memory of the first master's defeat would haunt the halls of the mansion for a long time to come. She had arrived quietly, but she had made her mark immediately, leaving a trail of fear and respect in her wake. And as she settled into her cot that night, listening to the distant calls of the fields and the soft creaking of the mansion, she knew that this was only the first of many battles to come, each one shaping the story of the most dangerous female slave in Georgia. The days following the first master's defeat passed in a strange, almost surreal rhythm. The plantation seemed the same on the surface, cotton fields stretching into the horizon, overseers barking orders, and the mansion towering like a symbol of untouchable power. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Fear, subtle but unmistakable, lingered like a shadow over the estate. The masters walked a little more cautiously, their eyes darting toward the new female slave whenever she moved through the fields, as though she were a storm they could see coming but could not fully prepare for. Whispers of her first confrontation spread quietly but swiftly, reaching even the far corners of the estate. Tales of her courage grew with each retelling, each version of the story becoming more dramatic, more terrifying. Among the other slaves, her presence was electric. They watched her move with the same meticulous attention she applied to the plantation itself, noting how she blended into shadows yet remained aware of every detail. She did not speak much, but her words, when spoken, carried weight, sharp and precise like the edge of a blade. A simple instruction or a subtle warning was enough to make others pause, to adjust their behavior without the need for coercion. She had a way of observing that made people feel seen in ways that were both comforting and unsettling. They began to share her stories quietly, passing along the legend of the woman who had bested a master with nothing but her strength, skill, and cunning. The masters, however, were slow to grasp the gravity of the situation. They were proud, arrogant men, raised to believe that fear could control anything and anyone, yet every time they tried to assert their dominance over her, they encountered resistance. Small, controlled, yet undeniably effective. It was never outright rebellion at first, but a subtle defiance that gnawed at their confidence. A glance that refused to lower, a stance that ignored their authority. A word that hinted at understanding and intelligence beyond what they expected from someone in her position. She was not openly defiant every moment, but her presence was a constant challenge to their authority, an unspoken declaration that she would not be controlled like the others. The more they tried to anticipate her actions, the more unpredictable she became. She learned the routines of the overseers, the timing of their patrols, the favored paths of the dogs, the moments when punishment was most likely to be inflicted, and she used that knowledge to her advantage. Every task she performed in the fields was done with careful attention, a calculated balance between compliance and assertion. To the casual observer, she was just another slave doing her work, but to those who watched closely, it was clear that every movement was deliberate, every interaction measured. She was learning the plantation the way a predator learns the terrain before a hunt, noting weaknesses, opportunities, and threats with unwavering focus. Word of her courage spread beyond the quarters. Even the men who had spent years hardened by brutality found themselves drawn to her story, a mix of awe and fear threading through their hearts. Some whispered secretly that she was more than human, that her presence was almost supernatural in the way it commanded attention and respect. Others, younger and less experienced, looked at her with admiration, seeing in her a symbol of hope and survival. They began to take cues from her behavior, learning small strategies to navigate the dangers of the plantation, inspired by the confidence she radiated. Her influence, subtle but profound, began to reshape the dynamic of the enslaved community. Yet, as her legend grew, so did the anxiety among the masters. The first master, humiliated and nursing both pride and wounds, had retreated to the mansion, but his mind was restless, plagued by the memory of her strength. He could not dismiss her so easily, and the knowledge that she had bested him lingered like a thorn in his pride. He began to speak of her in private, warning the other masters and overseers that she was dangerous and that any attempt to exploit or confront her should be approached with extreme caution. But caution, he realized, was not enough. Her awareness, intelligence, and ability to anticipate danger made her unpredictable, a quality that unsettled men who were used to absolute control. She, for her part, did not act out of arrogance or desire for confrontation. Her actions were always guided by survival, by the understanding that the world she inhabited was cruel and unforgiving. Every display of strength, every calculated move was a response to the reality of her situation. Yet, paradoxically, her survival instincts became a kind of teaching for those around her. The other slaves, watching carefully, learned to move with more awareness to protect themselves in ways they had never considered. She became an unintentional mentor, a silent force of empowerment, shaping the behavior of the enslaved community through example rather than instruction. Her intelligence extended beyond mere observation. She began to notice the cracks in the plantation's hierarchy, the small disagreements among the masters, the hidden resentments of the overseers, the fear that simmered beneath the surface of those who wielded power. She used these insights subtly, manipulating small situations without ever overtly revealing her intentions. A misstep by an overseer here, a carefully timed comment there, and suddenly a master's confidence would waver. She was not yet openly confrontational with these men, but the very knowledge that she understood the intricacies of their system made her untouchable in way. Brute strength alone could not achieve. Nightfall brought a different kind of challenge. The plantation, quiet and eerie under the cover of darkness, held dangers that were invisible in the daylight. Shadows seemed to move differently. The silence amplified every sound, and the distant calls of dogs and watchmen reminded her that even a single misstep could be fatal. Yet she navigated the night with ease, her awareness heightened, her senses attuned to every subtle shift in the environment. She observed the patterns of the guards, the tendencies of the dogs, and the routines of those in power, storing each piece of information for future use. To anyone else, the night was a time for rest and caution. To her, it was a laboratory of knowledge, a place to hone strategies for survival and defense. Her reputation among the other slaves became almost mythic. Tales of her first confrontation with the master were retold with increasing drama and intensity, each version emphasizing her courage, skill, and cunning. Children in the quarters would whisper about her bravery as they went to sleep. Women would exchange glances of admiration and hope, and even older, hardened men found themselves inspired by the quiet force she represented. The story of the woman who could stand against a master without fear became a symbol, a spark in the darkness, reminding everyone that even in a world designed to break them, strength and defiance could survive. The masters, meanwhile, grew more anxious with each passing day. The second master, younger and more reckless than the first, had begun to take notice. He was ambitious, eager to assert his dominance, and intrigued by the whispers of the woman's defiance. Where the first master had been cautious, this one was careless, underestimating her intelligence and resilience. He began to devise ways to test her, to probe her limits, and to assert control over her, convinced that fear could still be instilled where brute force had failed. Yet even as he planned, he sensed the tension in the air, the subtle shift in power dynamics, and the knowledge that this was no ordinary slave. The other slaves, sensing the danger that was building, began to prepare themselves in their own quiet ways. Some moved with more vigilance, others avoided unnecessary confrontations, and all watched her for guidance, whether she intended it or not. She had become a beacon, a silent leader, and her influence extended beyond her own actions. She was shaping the behavior and mindset of those around her, not through speeches or commands, but through her very presence, her courage, and her unflinching defiance. Her first confrontation had been violent and overt, but the days that followed were about subtlety and observation. She learned to read the intentions in a glance, to anticipate danger before it arrived, and to manipulate situations with precision. Each small act of awareness, each carefully measured response to threats, added to the that surrounded her. The plantation was learning that she could not be controlled, could not be broken, and could not be predicted. Her power was quiet but undeniable, and it grew stronger with every passing day. The tension reached a boiling point during the mid-afternoon work in the fields. The second master, emboldened by arrogance and curiosity, decided to test her directly. He approached with a confidence that belied his understanding of the danger he was walking into, but she was ready. She moved with the same precision and awareness that had saved her during the first confrontation, observing his movements, anticipating his intentions, and preparing her response. The other slaves held their breath, knowing that a second confrontation was imminent, and sensing that the stakes were higher this time. She did not act out of anger or revenge. Her actions were guided by survival, by understanding that each encounter could determine life or death. When the master reached out to assert control, she met him with the same calm precision that had disarmed the first. Every movement, every strike was deliberate, designed not only to protect herself, but to send a clear message: she would not be dominated, and any attempt to do so would come at a cost. The tension of the moment was electric, and even the wind seemed to pause as the confrontation unfolded. By the end of that day, her reputation had solidified into legend. The whispers of the slaves had turned into confident stat. Immense of awe, the fear of the masters had grown into tangible anxiety, and the plantation itself seemed to vibrate with the knowledge that something extraordinary was happening. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a force, a presence that could not be ignored, manipulated, or suppressed. The subtle power she wielded was as effective as the overt violence she had displayed, and her influence extended in ways the masters could not anticipate or counter. She had arrived quietly, but now her legend was impossible to contain. Every action, every glance, every carefully measured move contributed to the growing myth of the woman who could not be broken. The plantation, once a place of predictable oppression, had become a landscape of tension, fear, and anticipation. The masters learned that control could not be assumed, that defiance could manifest in unexpected ways, and that underestimating her would be a grave mistake. And as she rested that night, listening to the distant sounds of the fields and the mansion, she knew that her rise had only just begun, that the next confrontations would test her even further, and that the legend she was creating would soon reach its terrifying apex. The tension on the plantation had grown to an almost unbearable level. Whispers of the first master's defeat had spread beyond the quarters, traveling along the dirt paths and through the rows of cotton like a wildfire, twisting fear into every heart that heard it. The legend of the woman who could defy authority, who could resist domination with a precision and intelligence that no one expected, had taken on a life of its own. To the other slaves, she was no longer merely a survivor. She was a symbol of power, a force of nature that inspired awe and hope. To the masters, she had become a nightmare, an anomaly that could not be understood, much less controlled. By the time the second master attempted his ill-fated test of her strength, the stage was already set for a chain of confrontations that would solidify her reputation as the most dangerous female slave in Georgia. The second master, younger and more reckless than the first, had grown increasingly curious about the woman who had defeated a man he considered invincible. He strutted through the fields that afternoon with the arrogance of privilege, confident that fear could still bend her to his will. The sun beat down harshly, illuminating the sweat on the slave's brows and the sheen of effort on the cotton plants. He approached her slowly, deliberately, as if to assert his dominance through intimidation alone. But she did not flinch. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met his with a steady intensity that made him pause, even momentarily. There was no panic in her gaze, only awareness, a silent challenge that he had never anticipated. He reached out, this time with a subtle threat disguised as a touch, a testing of boundaries. She sidestepped smoothly, her movements fluid and precise, like water flowing around. A rock. When he tried to grab her wrist, she twisted sharply, knocking him off balance. The crack of the whip, meant to reinforce his authority, never came. The overseers, frozen in disbelief at the events unfolding, could only watch as the young master stumbled backward, his arrogance shattered by her speed and strength. The slaves around them held their breath, some daring to hope, others simply praying that the confrontation would not escalate further. The second master, humiliated, tried again, this time with brute force. He lunged at her, his hands aimed to restrain her, his anger and pride fueling every movement. She met him without hesitation, using his momentum against him, twisting and turning in a way that left him exposed and vulnerable. A kick to the chest, a sharp push to the shoulder, and he crashed to the ground, gasping in shock. The air was thick with tension, the field so silent that the soft rustle of leaves sounded like a cannon shot. She did not shout or taunt. Her calm composure only intensified the aura of danger surrounding her. By nightfall, the tale of the second confrontation had reached the quarters, carried by whispers and awed murmurs. The third master, older and known for his cruelty, had taken notice. Unlike the second, he was cautious, experienced in the ways of fear and control, but he underestimated the woman's ability to anticipate danger. He approached her under the pretense of giving orders in the fields, his tone calm, yet with an undercurrent of threat. But she had studied the subtle cues of each master, the way they moved, the moments when they hesitated, the patterns in their aggression. Every move he made was countered with precision, every attempt to dominate her met with strategic defense. He was shocked by her anticipation, the way she could read his intentions before he fully acted. In the first strike of confrontation, she caught his hand mid-motion, twisting his wrist and sending him stumbling backward. The field went silent again, overseers exchanging uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. He tried to regain control, attempting to assert his dominance with words and gestures, but she was unshaken. Her calmness, her unyielding gaze, and her deadly precision unnerved him more than any physical blow could. When he lunged, she sidestepped with the grace of a trained fighter, using his weight against him to bring him down. By the time the other slaves dared to exhale, the third master lay humiliated and disoriented, struggling to comprehend how this woman had turned his own strength into defeat. Word of the third master's failure spread like a creeping fire. Fear mingled with disbelief in the quarters, while in the mansion, the master's conversations became tense and whispered, filled with questions no one wanted to ask aloud. How could one woman, so seemingly ordinary, wield such power? How could she anticipate and counter each attempt to dominate her? The stories grew, each retelling embellishing her prowess, and soon the plantation itself seemed to shift under the weight of her legend. The fourth master, the most arrogant and violent of them all, had been observing the events from afar. He was a man who believed in absolute control, who had broken slaves with his fists and intimidation, and who assumed that fear was enough to bend any will. He approached her one morning, the air thick with the promise of violence. The sun was high and the field stretched endlessly before them, the heat magnifying the tension. The other slaves stopped their work discreetly, sensing the danger, and moved just out of view. The stage was set for the ultimate test of her skill, intelligence, and survival instinct. He attempted to corner her, moving with a confidence born of cruelty and expectation. But she was ready. Years of observation, every previous confrontation, and every moment of survival had prepared her for this. She anticipated his strikes, his feints, and his attempts at intimidation. When he lunged, she twisted, caught his arm, and used his momentum to throw him to the ground. The other slaves gasped, the sound barely a whisper carried across the fields. He rose again, rage written across his face, but she remained calm, her eyes unyielding, her body poised and ready. Every strike, every defensive maneuver was precise, a deadly dance that left him frustrated and disoriented. This confrontation was longer, more intense, and more dangerous than the others. The fourth master was relentless, striking again and again, each blow intended to dominate or harm her. But she had studied every master before him, had learned the patterns of arrogance and aggression, and anticipated each move with uncanny accuracy. A twist of the wrist here, a sidestep there, a calculated push or kick. Each action was designed to protect herself while exploiting his mistakes. By the time the fight ended, the fourth master lay exhausted, humiliated, and fearful in a way he had never experienced. His confidence shattered, he retreated, vowing revenge, but knowing deep down that this woman was a force he could not easily overcome. The other slaves, watching from the shadows, were silent for a moment, stunned into disbelief. Then whispers of awe spread, carried in hushed tones from quarter to quarter. She had faced 4 masters, each more arrogant or cruel than the last, and had emerged victorious every time. Her skill, intelligence, and courage had turned the tables on those who sought to dominate her, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. The plantation itself seemed to tremble, the balance of power shifting subtly but irrevocably. In the mansion, conversations turned urgent and tense. The masters could no longer ignore the reality before them. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been challenged in ways that no one could fully explain or control. Each defeat, each humiliation, was a mark of her growing power and influence, and with every retelling, every whisper among the other slaves, her legend grew stronger. She was no longer just a threat, she was an unstoppable force, a symbol of defiance that could not be contained. Even as she returned to the quarters that night, calm and composed, her mind was already calculating, planning and observing. She knew that her victories had changed the dynamics of the plantation forever. Masters and overseers would approach her with caution, slaves would look to her for guidance, and the stories of her defiance would grow with each telling. But she also knew that danger was far from over. Each encounter had taught her new lessons, revealed new weaknesses in those who sought to control her, and strengthened her understanding of survival. Her reputation had become larger than life, a force that even the most arrogant men could not ignore. Every glance from a master carried hesitation, every interaction was measured with care, and every whisper among the slaves reinforced the growing myth of her strength and intelligence. She had faced 4 masters, each more dangerous and determined than the last, and had emerged victorious every time. Her courage and skill were unmatched, her awareness unmatched, and her presence alone had begun to alter the balance of power on the plantation. By the time night fell, the plantation had transformed into a place of tension, fear, and anticipation. The other slaves slept with a newfound sense of hope, inspired by the woman who had dared to resist and survived. The masked Ares, meanwhile, could not rest, haunted by the memory of their failures and the realization that the woman they had underestimated was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The 4 confrontations had not only tested her skill, but had also solidified her legend, ensuring that her story would echo through the fields, quarters, and mansion for years to come. In the quiet moments before dawn, as the wind whispered through the cotton fields and the distant calls of dogs echoed in the night, she sat quietly, reflecting on the battles of the day. Each victory had been hard won, each encounter a test of her intelligence, skill, and courage. But she knew that her story was far from over. The plantation had felt the force of her defiance, had seen the cost of underestimating her, and would never be the same again. Her journey was only beginning, and the legend of the most dangerous female slave in Georgia was far from complete. The days after the 4 masters' humiliations passed slowly, the plantation a place transformed by tension and unspoken dread. The fields looked the same, the cotton plants swaying in the wind, the dust rising from the workers' feet. But everything had changed beneath the surface. Every glance carried caution, every movement was measured, and every word spoken seemed to carry weight beyond its sound. The masters walked a little more carefully now, their arrogance tempered by the memory of the woman who had shattered their illusions of control. They could know. Erased the events from their minds, nor could they explain them rationally. Something about her presence, her calm defiance, and her lethal precision had left an indelible mark on the plantation, one that would be felt for years to come. The woman herself moved through this new world with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the battles. She no longer needed to prove her strength in the same overt ways. Her legend preceded her. Every master who attempted to assert authority approached her with caution. Every overseer hesitated to give orders, and every slave watched her with a mixture of awe and hope. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a symbol, a beacon of resistance in a place built to crush spirit and hope. Her influence spread quietly but inexorably, shaping behavior, inspiring courage, and reminding everyone that power could exist outside the hands of the oppressors. The other slaves began to change subtly in response to her presence. Some who had previously moved through the fields with their heads down and spirits broken now dared to glance up, to assert themselves in small ways, to carry themselves with the confidence they had long abandoned. Mothers whispered lessons of vigilance and courage to their children, using the woman's story as proof that strength and intelligence could survive even the harshest oppression. The young men in the quarters began to plan more carefully, inspired by her ability to anticipate danger and protect herself. Her legend was teaching them strategy, patience, and the value of awareness in a world designed to dominate and destroy. The masters, on the other hand, became increasingly haunted. Each one replayed their humiliations in private, unable to forget the shock of encountering a slave who could resist and outmaneuver them. The first master, once proud and arrogant, moved through the mansion with a wary eye, haunted by the memory of her strength. He could not speak of it openly, for fear of admitting vulnerability, but the image of her calm, unyielding gaze haunted him in the quiet moments before sleep. The second, reckless and impulsive, found himself second-guessing every decision, recalling the precision with which she had turned his own aggression against him. The third master, experienced and cruel, could not comprehend how she had anticipated his every move, leaving him confused and fearful. And he fourth, violent and unrelenting, wrestled with rage, humiliation, and a creeping fear he could not suppress. Each man was forever changed, their authority undermined by one woman's courage and skill. Even the overseers, who had once enforced rules with brutal efficiency, became cautious. They watched her from a distance, their usual confidence tempered by the knowledge that any misstep could provoke consequences beyond their understanding. Whispers circulated in the quarters, in the fields, and even through the mansion itself, telling tales of her victories, each retelling growing more dramatic, more awe-inspiring. She'd become untouchable, not because she was invincible, but because her intelligence, awareness, and courage had rendered her a figure that none could fully predict or control. Fear had become her armor, respect her shield, and legend her weapon. The psychological impact of her actions spread beyond the immediate participants. Slaves who had felt broken, who had accepted the inevitability of abuse and domination, now felt a flicker of hope. They saw that defiance was possible, that courage could survive even in the darkest corners of oppression. Some began to move with more awareness, taking small risks to protect themselves and their loved ones, learning from her example. Others shared her story quietly with those who had not witnessed her actions firsthand, ensuring that her reputation extended far beyond the fields where she labored. She had not only survived, she had taught survival in its most potent form, a combination of intelligence, courage, and unflinching awareness. The masters, desperate to reclaim control, attempted various methods to undermine her reputation or regain authority. They issued harsher orders, punished other slaves to reinforce fear, and spread rumors intended to tarnish her name. But each attempt backfired subtly. The slaves, inspired by her courage, saw through the intimidation tactics. They began to rely on one another in ways they had not before, coordinating movements in the fields, sharing information, and protecting themselves. The very act of resisting control had become contagious, a quiet rebellion spreading through the plantation under the surface of fear and labor. She had sparked a movement without lifting a hand beyond her own defense. Her influence extended to those who had previously dismissed her as weak or insignificant. Even young women, often overlooked by the masters, began to observe her carefully, learning to navigate the dangers of the plantation with the same intelligence and awareness she displayed. They practiced subtle strategies, from careful positioning in the fields to understanding the moods and patterns of their oppressors. Her presence had transformed them from passive survivors into active participants in their own survival, and in doing so, she reshaped the social dynamics of the entire enslaved community. The masters, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. Eve, Wry glance in her direction was filled with apprehension, every interaction measured with extreme care. The mansion, once a place of unquestioned authority, had become a psychological battlefield, with the woman's presence casting a long, invisible shadow over every room. The first master would jump at sudden movements, haunted by memories of his defeat. The second master, reckless by nature, became cautious to the point of hesitation, doubting his own instincts. The third master, once confident in his cruelty, moved with careful precision, attempting to predict her responses but never fully succeeding. And the fourth master, consumed by pride and humiliation, constantly feared the next confrontation, never certain when or how it might come. Her influence had extended beyond physical defiance. It had invaded the minds of those who had once ruled unchallenged. Even the quietest corners of the plantation bore the weight of her presence. In the slave quarters, whispers of her victories inspired secret strategies, alliances, and caution. Children heard stories of her courage before sleep, learning early that intelligence, observation, and bravery could be as powerful as any weapon. The older slaves, who had lived under tyranny for decades, saw a reflection of resistance they had long thought impossible. Her legend became both a shield and a spark, a reminder that oppression could be challenged and that the human spirit, when honed and disciplined, could survive and even thrive under unimaginable conditions. The psychological warfare she had waged, without lifting a hand beyond her own self-defense, continued to unfold. The masters, desperate to maintain control, increased their scrutiny and punishment of others, yet each act only reinforced the caution and cunning of those who observed her example. Fear had spread unevenly across the plantation, concentrated in the hearts of those who had underestimated her and mirrored in the careful vigilance of those who sought to emulate her strategies. She had become a pivot point around which the balance of power shifted, and her legend would not be confined to the present, it would echo for years. Her own mind, however, remained sharp and focused. She did not rest on her victories, nor did she allow herself to be consumed by pride. Each day was a continuation of observation, learning, and preparation. She studied the patterns of her oppressors, the habits of the overseers, and the reactions of the other slaves, building a mental map of the plantation that allowed her to navigate danger with precision. Every encounter, every whisper, every subtle shift in power was analyzed and catalogued in her mind. She understood that survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and intelligence, and she wielded these qualities with unmatched skill. By the end of the first month, her legend had become a tangible force. The plantation no longer operated under the same assumptions of absolute control. Masters doubted themselves, overseers hesitated, and slaves acted with a cautious empowerment that had not existed before. Her victories over the four masters were not isolated incidents, they were catalysts for change, symbols of what could be achieved when courage and intelligence intersected with the will to survive. She had transformed the plantation from a place of predictable oppression into a landscape of uncertainty where fear, respect, and hope coexisted in delicate balance. Her story spread beyond the plantation, carried by travelers, whispers, and word of mouth across the surrounding estates. Other enslaved people learned of her defiance, her intelligence, and her precision. In distant quarters and neighboring fields, her name became synonymous with resistance, and her story served as inspiration for those who had been told they had no power. The legend of the woman who bested four masters became a cautionary tale for oppressors and a symbol of possibility for the oppressed. Even as time passed, the psychological imprint of her actions endured. Masters could not forget the humiliation of their defeats, and the fear lingered like a shadow over their every command. Slaves carried the memory of her courage, using it as a guide for their own survival. She had changed the landscape of the plantation, not through conquest, but through awareness, skill, and unwavering defiance. Her influence endured in every cautious step, every calculated action, and every whispered story passed from one generation to the next. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the cotton fields and the distant calls of dogs echoed in the night, She would sit and reflect, not with arrogance but with awareness. Each confrontation, each battle, had been a lesson in survival and strategy. She knew that her story was far from over, that the dangers of the plantation were ongoing, and that each day demanded vigilance, intelligence, and courage. Her victories were not merely personal, they were a beacon, a warning, and a lesson all at once. A testament to the power of defiance in a world designed to crush the human spirit. Her legacy was sealed not by violence alone, but by the combination of courage, intelligence, and calculated defiance that left both slaves and masters alike forever changed. She had faced 4 masters, each more dangerous and arrogant than the last, and had emerged victorious. She had inspired hope, instilled fear, and transformed the social and psychological landscape of the plantation. Her story would endure, whispered in the quarters, carried across the fields, and remembered long after the day's work was done. In the years that followed, she became a legend, her name a symbol of courage and defiance that no master could erase. The plantation had witnessed something extraordinary. A woman who refused to be broken, who turned the tools of oppression into instruments of survival, and who demonstrated, with every calculated move and every unwavering gaze, that the human spirit could endure, resist, and triumph even in the darkest of circumstances.